Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we consider another major character of the story, the lover of Winston and the rebel from the waist down, Julia. Along with Winston and O'Brien, Julia is one of the three main characters of the novel and an important step for Winston in his progression towards his greater defiance of the party and eventually into the arms of the Ministry of Love. So who is Julia? Julia is a dark-haired, freckled-faced girl who works in the fiction department of the Ministry of Truth, the same place Winston works as a mechanic on the novel-writing machines. These devices artificially create novels and other literature for prole consumption, one of many means by which the party maintains its grip over the ignorant masses. At the opening of the novel, Winston is highly wary of her as he considers her just the type of person to spy on him for any signs of unorthodoxy and to turn him in to the Thought Police. In one instance, Winston caught her glancing at him, an experience that filled him with black terror. Despite this general dislike of her, given this tendency of party women, especially the younger ones, Winston is also admittedly attracted to her. In part, it's this very physical attraction that likely fuels his dislike, given he knows that he could never have any kind of intimate relationship with her. To solidify this impregnable image he has of her, Julia is also a paid-up member of the so-called Junior Anti-Sex League, a group within Oceania who advocates procreation via artificial insemination and for there to be zero sexual intercourse, even in marriage. Her apparent devotion to this cause is symbolised by her wearing of the scarlet sash of her group, which Winston notes was wound around her waist several times, just enough to accentuate the shapeliness of her hips. Julia, by all early appearances, seems to confirm all of Winston's thoughts about her, yelling loudly for the death of traitors in any crowd, and even outdoing others in her vitriol directed at Emmanuel Goldstein during the 2 minutes hate. Winston notes that with a boyish jerk of her arm, she launched a Newspeak dictionary at the nose of Goldstein. Winston suspects throughout the first part of the novel that Julia has some malign interest in him. She appears close to him in the 2 minutes hate and glances at him sometimes. When he spots her as he walks outside of Mr. Charrington's shop, his suspicions about her tailing him are all but confirmed, and he even considers murdering her before she can denounce him. Of course, Winston's interpretation of her is erroneous. Following the smuggling of the note to him, Winston's world is upturned, and their highly forbidden love affair ensues. It's in part 2 that we learn more about her. We know she has been a rebel against the party for at least a decade or so before her affair with Winston. She is 26 years old on their first meeting. She tells Winston her first love affair was at the age of 16 with a fellow party member of 60. This first lover committed suicide to avoid arrest, which also spared her an earlier stay in the Ministry of Love. It's not certain if or how long the party knew about her own defiance, but lacking any concrete evidence in the law, we can assume she successfully cheated the party for some years at least, possibly even up to her encounters with Winston. We know Winston himself was being watched, according to O'Brien, for 7 years, covering the entirety of the novel and their affair. Unlike Winston, Julia makes a conscious, conspicuous effort to appear orthodox, as we have noted. She works even longer hours than Winston's 60 per week, as well as working in the fiction department on the novel-writing machines. Julia also spent some time working on erotic material for proles, a particular mark of good character and an unwitting praise by the party of her own disguise. As well as her general working hours, Julia also puts in extra hours posting Junior Anti-Sex League literature around London. At school, she had been captain of the hockey team. She had won the gymnastics trophy 2 years in a row. In addition, she had been a troop leader in the Spies and then a branch secretary in the Youth League. Overall, she had thus spent considerable time and effort cultivating her pure image for effective camouflage. Unlike Winston, Julia was raised some years after the revolution. Her memories are thus hazy concerning the world before the party. Her most notable source of the pre-revolutionary world, at least earlier on, was likely her grandfather, whom she notes disappeared when she was about 8. It's also likely too that her first lover, a man of 60 some 10 years before, also had clear memories of the time that he related to his young lover. Though she probably had some idea of what life was like before the party and Big Brother, she still considered any rebellion outside of the personal as silly. The party was unassailable, but if you were clever, you could cheat the party to have your own pleasure and secret life. Julia, to her credit, is likely very good at this type of defiance. By her time with Winston, she has had scores of encounters without being caught, or with fellow outer party members. If we take her at her word, then she has had many encounters, at least 40 if we take her phrasing literally, possibly involving multiple lovers. The evidence supports this, with Winston noting with admiration that she took charge in their own initial meetings, precisely planning the means by which they could meet, and having a route planned and rehearsed in her head before even talking with him. Another impressive trait is her resourcefulness. Though Winston too shows a certain knack for obtaining certain things, like razor blades and his diary and pen for example, Julia is able to obtain black market goods, such as white bread, jam, sugar, and real coffee. Despite all of this, however, Julia is, at heart, no revolutionary. Unlike Winston, she has no independent interest in overthrowing the party. Indeed, as touched upon already, she has no genuine belief that this is even possible. Her rebellion, as Winston notes, always came back to her own pleasure and sexuality. If considered in that context, Julia was capable of great acuteness of thought. However, anything political or otherwise concerning their world invariably bored her to the point of even putting her to sleep. Though arguably being a better rebel than Winston, Julia's fate is tied to her lovers, and her downfall comes with their affair. Though it's impossible to know exactly when the Thought Police became aware of her, at least at the latest, Charrington would have been aware Winston had a lover when Winston rented the room. As Winston notes, he knew it was for the purpose of a love affair. Perhaps Julia exposed herself as early as the encounter outside of Charrington's shop, just prior to the note-giving incident, or more generally with her interest in Winston. Given the length of Julia's own time as a rebel, around a decade, we can safely assume she successfully avoided detection up to her time with Winston. Once their affair had begun, however, her fate too was sealed, assuming we take O'Brien's later information that Winston himself had been watched for some 7 years as true. Before meeting O'Brien, Julia refused to believe the so-called Brotherhood existed, that is, the shadowy organisation set up by and led by Emmanuel Goldstein. Julia may in fact be right about this, as O'Brien, though refusing to confirm whether or not it exists later on, does admit to fabricating Goldstein's book, and since he is revealed as totally loyal to the party and Big Brother, we can assume the group is at least used as a false flag tool, if it is not totally fictitious. Julia also notes that the war fought between Oceania and its rivals is likely all a large fraud too. Winston, for his part, had simply not considered this possibility. Julia further theorises the bombs and attacks suffered by Airstrip 1 are most likely launched by the party itself, simply to keep everyone frightened. Though she did not read the book herself, only partially listening to parts of it, this does roughly tally with O'Brien's description of reality. The endless war is indeed a mechanism by which the party maintains its grip over Oceania, and the wars fought are much smaller scale and controlled than may be assumed by most, in contrast to previous warfare. A final interesting take given to us by Julia is on her clear understanding of the party's ironclad grip on the sexual act. Sex is, by its very nature, threatening to party control. As an intimate act between individuals, it can obviously create and strengthen bonds outside of love for the party and Big Brother. Sex, she notes, also uses energy and creates contentment the party wants individuals to reserve solely for devotion to it and Big Brother. Winston notes that, unlike himself, Julia was fully cognizant of the party's reasoning behind its heavy control of sex. Sex's only function was to produce children for the service to the party. Their affair then, despite Julia's own political and ideological apathy, is ironically a political act, a very physical repudiation of devotion to the party, Big Brother, for a strong devotion to one another, most physically represented in the sexual act. Later in the novel, this naturally becomes the focus of O'Brien and the party's efforts when finally breaking Winston's spirit. After having suffered every humiliation and injury, it was his love for Julia that endured up to his time in room 101. By the end of the second part of the novel, Julia's suspicions on the falsity of the resistance are confirmed, and she too is taken along with Winston. Sadly, this was the last time the two would see each other as themselves. Julia is punched in the stomach and is hauled unceremoniously out of the room. The next Winston and we see of her is much later, and unfortunately, we only have O'Brien's words to guide us up to then. Though Winston's question on whether she was tortured went unanswered, it's very probable she was. Indeed, Winston's question was almost certainly rhetorical and uttered largely in a desperate hope for a negative answer. Winston himself muses earlier on in his own interrogation that the beatings, interminable questioning and confessions were all part of the course, and thus likely suffered by Julia too. O'Brien informs Winston that Julia broke quickly, her conversion being a textbook case. To be fair to her, Julia loosely predicts such an outcome just before they are caught, though she thinks, like Winston, that the feelings they have for each other within were unreachable. They could, she says, force them to say anything, but their feelings would remain inviolate. With nothing else to go on, we can assume Julia broke quickly, broadly suffering a similar ordeal to Winston. I say broadly, as given she was converted quickly, it's likely her time in the Ministry of Love was much shorter. Winston, by contrast, was a difficult case, according to O'Brien. Julia was likely released before Winston, like him, broken physically and mentally by the experience. Julia admits she betrayed Winston, that is, in the same manner he did in room 101. Sadly, the love the two once felt had been destroyed by the party, their love replaced by that for Big Brother. As with the deeper level of control demonstrated over the individual itself, the destruction of their relationship also showcases the potential control that a totalitarian state can have over the most intimate bonds too. So, that was Julia, one of the three main characters of 1984 explored. A woman of exceptional guile, intelligence and bravery, unfortunately crushed by the all-powerful party in Orwell's dystopian world. A popular question often considered by fans of George Orwell's 1984 is if Winston's lover Julia faced her own ordeal in room 101. Welcome to 1984 lore, and today we shall attempt to riddle this out. The question as to whether Julia faced her own worst thing in the world is certainly answerable. Sadly, in the last chapter of the novel, Winston recalls meeting Julia for the last time, though both former lovers are very different people. Little to nothing of the former inquisitive and intellectual Winston remains, and Julia too is noticeably changed both physically and mentally. Quote, "Her face was sallower, and there was a long scar, partly hidden by the hair, across her forehead and temple. Her waist had grown thicker and, in a surprising way, had stiffened." Winston furthermore compares the rigidness of her body with that of a corpse he had helped to drag out of some ruins during a rocket bomb attack, thinking it was almost like stone. In addition, any affection she had had for him had been replaced by contempt and dislike. The key bit of information then comes a few words later when she mirrors Winston's own desperate pleas during his own ordeal in room 101. Quote, "Sometimes," she said, "they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, can't even think about. And then you say, 'Don't do it to me, do it to somebody else, do it to so-and-so.' And perhaps she might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you had just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself. All you care about is yourself, he echoed. And after that, you don't feel the same towards the other person any longer. No, he said, you don't feel the same. This dialogue makes it quite clear that Julia had to face her own ordeal in room 101, though an intriguing point to highlight is that she does not specifically confirm it was Winston who was the only person in the world who could take her place. She confirms she betrayed him, but this is vague and may not be meant in the same way Winston betrayed her in his room 101 experience. Of course, this could also simply be put down to awkwardness, shame, or mere indifference. However, another tantalizing possibility is that there was another person, even dearer to her, that was her only means of escape. Personally, I don't think this is the case, or at least I like to believe that it isn't. What is remarkable too is that, unlike Winston, who has been largely emotionally denuded by this stage, Julia does retain something of her so-called inner mind or spirit. She does have somewhat of an emotional, albeit negative, reaction to looking at Winston. The more subtle sign of emotional depth is in the description of her as they both sat together, in which she moved her feet a few centimeters and deliberately crushed a twig. This seems to betray nervousness or awkwardness, which seems confirmed in the subsequent language of her words to Winston. I think, then, that so-and-so is very likely to be Winston, though, of course, the possibility remains there was another lover or loved one closer to her than Winston. Julia, then, has clearly endured her own time in room 101 and betrayed Winston during her interrogation at least. However, now we come to the trickier question of what exactly is for Julia the worst thing in the world. Surprisingly, perhaps, this too is actually quite answerable. There are subtle hints earlier on and in the last chapter itself that indicate what Julia fears most. Firstly, we must consider Julia's reaction to O'Brien's words back in chapter 8 of part 2. During the meeting in which O'Brien is apparently inducting both her and Winston into the shadowy brotherhood, O'Brien takes it for granted that Winston speaks both for himself and her. In what may be a standard initiation process, O'Brien proceeds to ask Winston what he'll do for the Brotherhood, which includes murder, forgery, and sabotage, among other things. Most shockingly perhaps, O'Brien even asks if Winston would be willing to throw sulfuric acid into a child's face if it was somehow necessary, to which he also assents. The one thing Julia herself objects to is a potential order for her and Winston to permanently part, to which she passionately objects. Winston, after some effort, agrees. It is at this point that O'Brien addresses Julia herself, pointing out that it may become necessary to physically alter Winston through surgery, even adding that they sometimes amputate a limb for good measure. It's at this point that Winston notes that, quote, Julia had turned a shade paler so that her freckles were showing. It's telling too that, despite this, she still faced O'Brien boldly, murmuring something that he took as assent. This isn't much, of course, but it is enough. Furthermore, while this could be coincidence on Orwell's part, it's also telling that Julia's reaction to surgical alteration provokes a similar reaction to at least 3 other party members that we know were ordered to room 101. Firstly, there was an unnamed female party member who Winston recalls being consigned to room 101 sometime after the removal of Parsons from his cell. She reacts to her fate by shriveling and turning a different colour. A second and more memorable instance was the reaction of the skull-faced man later on in the chapter. Already starved close to death, this character is clearly a foreshadowing of Winston's own physical state later on in the story. When sentenced to room 101, quote, the man's face, already very pale, turned a colour Winston would not have believed possible. it was definitely, unmistakably, a shade of green. Finally, and if the former two examples are not exactly the same reaction, we do have a direct link with none other than Winston himself. In Part 2, Chapter 4, while Winston and Julia are in their hiding place above Charrington's shop, his reaction to the appearance of a rat is to drain of colour in a similar manner to Julia later in O'Brien's office. Julia notes, quote, "Dearest, you've gone quite pale. What's the matter? Do they make you feel sick?" Rats, of course, are Winston's worst fear. Even if the previous comparisons are not convincing, and they are, then this direct connection must be. Of course, as with other issues, we cannot be 100% certain. However, the connection is there, and given this, we can reasonably assume that surgery, or more specifically, disfigurement, perhaps, is Julia's worst thing in the world. If you recall too from earlier in the video, there is another crucial bit of information we have that all but confirms this. Winston noted a long scar across her forehead and temple. Of course, this could have feasibly been due to injuries sustained in some other part of her interrogation. Winston too, after all, suffered physical changes not associated with Room 101 specifically, such as the loss of his teeth and hair. However, it's hard to believe that Orwell would add such a detail arbitrarily. This incidentally opens up a further possibility that Julia did better than Winston in facing her fear. Winston, of course, was driven near mad just by the threat of the rats itself, the beasts not physically touching or injuring him. Julia, by contrast, has been scarred, which suggests she was either too slow to grasp what she had to do, that is, put another in her place, or more admirably, that she resisted to the point that she was cut. Sadly, given what she reveals, and also considering that she has not been significantly disfigured beyond this scar, it's almost certain that she, like Winston, was ultimately broken in Room 101. Another point worth highlighting too is the information O'Brien gives us. Though it's perfectly possible he was lying to further demoralise Winston, according to him, Julia, unlike Winston, was a textbook conversion, with her coming over to the party quickly and instantly betraying him. I'm in two minds about this. On the one hand, this does seem feasible, given who Julia is. Julia is younger than Winston and O'Brien. She's from a generation that has grown up with the party and implicitly accepts it as permanent and perhaps even legitimate in a way. Julia's own rebellion is quite different from Winston's, in that it was always personal and sexual in nature. Julia is not an intellectual dissident, and where a point of fact does not touch upon her own life or pleasure, she is utterly uninterested in it. We see this in her apathy to who Oceania is at war with, or on who invented particular things. When Winston announces he has the book and insists she read it, she again expresses disinterest, suggesting he read it aloud instead, after which she quickly falls asleep. The point then is that, in terms of the principles of Ingsoc, or playing the part of a good party member at least, Julia has little trouble. She effectively is already orthodox, and may even have a love of Big Brother of some kind. Of course, this is not to suggest Julia is not a thought criminal of any kind. She is, and has committed multiple sex crimes. However, unlike Winston, there is much less intellectually wrong with her. Given this, it's easy for me to believe that O'Brien was thus sincere that Julia was generally easy to convert back to the fold. On the contrary, however, given we earlier saw signs she had actually resisted Room 101 longer than Winston, and assuming he was her person to put in her place there, was O'Brien therefore only speaking in half-truths? Yes, she was easy to bring back into the fold generally, but as we've seen, she did love Winston. It was she who passionately objected to parting with Winston in the meeting after all. Perhaps both lovers of 1984 had inverted and opposite success, if we can call it that, in resisting the party. Winston was a difficult case, standing out against the pain of torture, taking some time to be intellectually and emotionally moulded, whereas Julia quickly came through the process, but proved emotionally resistant to giving up Winston in room 101. This is all, of course, speculation on my part. What I think we can say then is that Julia, firstly, did endure room 101, secondly, that her particular fear was disfigurement, and finally, that she perhaps resisted longer than Winston. A final point that may seal the deal, so to speak, for some listeners is to simply consider Julia's personality and motivations. As noted before, Julia's opposition to the party is not political or intellectual. Julia enjoys sex and perhaps the thrill of her affairs too, both things the party happen to forbid. This fact is significant for our purposes today, and it ties in with her greatest fear. For Julia, given she is young and attractive, traits that feed into her love for sex and pleasure, facial disfigurement is a sure way of affecting this. As Winston noted on Julia, for her, everything came back to her own sexuality, and when this was touched upon in any way, she cared. Possible permanent disfigurement, then, is perhaps her worst fear, as to become permanently unattractive strikes at the very core of her purpose for life and her joy of living. It stabs right at the heart of her identity. So, that was Julia and her likely worst fear in room 101. What do you think? Was Julia confronted by facial disfigurement in room 101? A classic question that often occurs to fans of 1984 is if Julia, fellow rebel and lover of Winston Smith, was in fact a spy. Welcome to 1984 lore, and today we consider the pros and cons of this theory. So why do some people believe Julia is a spy? Well, Winston himself was not averse to the possibility earlier on in the novel. He often considered that Julia could very well be an independent sneak. That is, an enthusiastic and bigoted party member who eagerly sought out thought criminals of her own volition. True, Winston did not seriously think she could be a full-blown member of the thought police itself, thinking this unlikely, but that her frequent glances at him and inordinate proximity to him at times was worrying enough. Winston mused that Julia was just the sort to denounce him, her sort being the young women who were often the most bigoted members of the party, the swallowers of slogans and nosers out of unorthodoxy, as Winston put it. The first solid reason we might have to doubt her is just who she is and the potential of that as a source of arrests for the thought police. While Winston may broadly be correct in thinking she is not a full member of the thought police, Julia could still very well be associated with them and loosely work for them. Indeed, many spies in our history were young, attractive women. These women found it easy to seduce and entrap enemy men and were highly valued sources of intelligence for their handlers. Undoubtedly, Julia at least could, very feasibly, have been a spy, given she was attractive. Even the party leaders acknowledged that the male sex instinct is less controllable than women's. We know this from Julia's explanation as to how pornosec is staffed. The department is almost exclusively staffed with young girls, whose sexual instincts are said to be more controllable. The theory further goes that they are less likely to be corrupted by the filth produced there for the proletariat. The party even frowns upon married women working there, with only the head of the department not being a young and pure girl. The point here is that the party are perfectly aware that, even in their oppressive society, men can be tempted by or manipulated through sex. It is a sure path to sex crime and thought crime, and so a good way to root out such heretics. A second reason to suspect Julia is in her attraction to Winston to begin with. Though it may be controversial to say, looks are at least the initial overriding factor in initiating sexual relationships. Winston is 13 years older than Julia, and clearly considers himself unattractive in a conventional sense. Quote, "Now that you've seen what I'm really like, can you still bear to look at me?" "Yes, easily. I'm 39 years old. I've got a wife that I can't get rid of. I've got varicose veins. I've got 5 false teeth. I couldn't care less," said the girl. Of course, many may cite the old adage that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and this may very well be the case with Julia and Winston. Winston may simply be attractive to her in his manner and attitude. Indeed, she later says there was something about him that she knew he was against them, that is, the party. She did witness Winston emerging from Charrington's shop, humming an old tune. Such an act in itself was unusual, and in the world of 1984, brave. It's not difficult, therefore, to imagine that Julia was attracted to Winston, given his apparent, almost brazen opposition to the party. To be mysterious and brave holds an attraction in and of itself for some. Another pertinent point is on the availability of partners in this world. Unlike in our world, Julia couldn't simply log into Tinder or Bumble and right swipe on a nice man she liked. Any relationships, even those between parent and child, let alone lovers, are highly dangerous, with the risk of denunciation being high. Julia does later frame her contact with Winston as taking a chance, implying that she knows such contact could go very wrong. Given partner options are obviously very restricted, is Julia's interest in pursuit of Winston really that unrealistic? Wheeling back for a few moments, there is also the matter of the catalyst of the relationship to begin with. Isn't Julia's note with the words "I love you" written on it, on closer consideration, a bit odd and a red flag? Love is a strong word to apply to a man you've never properly met. Shouldn't Winston have had alarm bells ringing in his head at this? Incidentally, the manner in which the note was smuggled to Winston is also suspect. Though Julia staged a fall to enable Winston to physically contact her to receive the note, this was still incredibly risky, perhaps too risky to not be incredible. All of this took place in full view of a telescreen. We know how perceptive watchers are. One famous example is that of the instructress during Winston's morning exercise, who instantly picked up on his lackluster effort in touching his toes. The watchers in the Ministry of Love were similarly hypervigilant, screaming at Winston for covering his face or putting his hands in his pockets. Winston furthermore instinctively knows people will be watching the telescreens placed in the toilets too. Both Winston and Julia know the dangers of telescreens. Winston initially rejects Julia's later suggestion that they meet in Victory Square because of them. Given this, Julia's choice of location for first contact is highly suspect. The scene also takes place very close to the eventual initial meeting place of Winston and O'Brien, in which O'Brien writes clearly and unabashedly in front of the telescreen his address for Winston. Was the link of location between the two scenes a subtle nod by Orwell of Julia's true identity too? O'Brien, after all, did prove to be a spy. Pushing back on these points, firstly we have to consider the context of the situation too. Julia could not know Winston's location or particular movements at any given time, and so the location may very well have been the best chance of contact. The passing of a note in the canteen may have been riskier with both telescreens and other prying eyes there. Approaching Winston in any other way would be highly suspect, and leaving the note with him in some other way loses the connection with her. On reflection, the scene of the note giving was probably a matter of luck, an arbitrary decision. Julia perhaps likely planned for some time to get Winston alone. She was often noted to be close to him at times, such as at the 2 minutes hate. She also followed him to Charrington's too. For all we know, this staged fall was the latest and at last successful attempt at contact. Julia later says to Winston that she's likely better at finding things out than he is. Perhaps she had some information on his movements and planned the fall to coincide with his break, or at a point she knew he would be walking down the corridor. On the risk of the telescreen, this may simply have been an unavoidable hazard and drawback of the location. Telescreens and microphones are everywhere anyway, so perhaps Julia's choice of location was merely the best of a bad bunch of scenarios she had considered. In the event too, she evidently thought the risk was worth it to initiate contact. On the content of the note, on initial consideration the words may seem extreme, but
when I think about it more, they also make sense given the context of the situation. Any written note is highly dangerous if found. Handwriting may give the writer away easily, and so a very short note makes sense. In this spirit, it further makes sense that the shorter the message, the better. However, it must also be clear to avoid taking further risk with another note or contact attempt. The idea, too, is to set up trust. After the note, both Winston and Julia trust each other and can surreptitiously communicate, so it was also a one-time risk of potentially incriminating her. Something like, "Meet me at X," or something like that invites doubt from Winston. He may be frightened off. Meet for what, he may have thought. "I love you" is direct and unambiguous, leaving Winston no room for doubt as to Julia's intentions. Indeed, Winston even frames her actions as advances after receiving it, showing the words had the desired effect. "I love you" then is not particularly a red flag of Julia's double agent status, in my opinion. Putting our conspiratorial hats back on, at the meeting in the clearing, there are other possible indications of Julia's spy status. We have touched upon a couple already. Firstly, Julia says she's good at spotting people who don't belong, saying it was something about Winston's look that gave him away. We must assume that Winston's expression is not so indicative of his thought crime as to be obvious, as otherwise he would have been denounced long ago by any random party comrade, let alone comrades like Syme or Parsons who knew him well. Given this, it logically follows that Julia is particularly skilled at spotting heretical faces, and this is obviously a skill shared by members of the Thought Police. In addition, she also admits in the same meeting that she is good at finding out things about people, which is literally the whole point of a spy, to gather intelligence on people. To be fair, her exact wording is she's better than Winston at finding things out, like his name. Being better than him does not necessarily translate to her being the oceanic equivalent of Matahari. For those fully buying into the spy theory, the fact that she was also a troop leader in the spies themselves is also significant. For me though, this fact alone is not that convincing. Many kids are routinely inducted into the spies, and a wider culture exists of denunciation anyway. Troop leader does distinguish her somewhat, but is not that spectacular. In addition, Julia does explain that participation in such groups, at least after the age of 16 if not before, was largely for what she called her camouflage. Julia explains to Winston later that participation in the Junior Anti-Sex League, after-work activities, lectures and community stuff etc. were all good for covering up her affairs. Given we know Julia clothes herself in good deeds in her adult life, this does somewhat dull the glint of her childhood in the spies somewhat. We know from what she tells Winston that she has been a sex criminal since the age of 16, having had an affair with a party member aged 60. We simply don't know how far back Julia's own thought crime goes, and her philosophy on eager participation in groups to cover it up. Another red flag for some is the amount of successful encounters Julia has had. At meeting Winston, she was 26. Having begun her sex crimes at 16, that's an impressive decade's worth of time without being caught. Some might say this is too convenient. Given we know how efficient the Thought Police are, this point does seem convincing. Just given the odds alone, could Julia really have eluded detection for that long? Even assuming she's only had 4 or 5 sexual partners, including Winston, given denunciations and tortures are fairly common, surely some connection would have arisen at some point in all that time. I can assume any amount of sexual partners, given I presume Julia is referring to the sexual act itself when Winston asks if she's done this before. She may very well have had sex many times or scores of times as she claims. But if we reread the dialogue in Chapter 2 of Part 2, she never actually confirms how many individual men she has slept with. Winston asks if she's been with inner party members, and she answers she's only been with outer party members, but doesn't give a number. The number then could be as low as 2 or 3, including Winston, or as high as double digits or more. The point here is that the higher the number of partners over that long stretch of time, then, the higher the probability she would have been caught. This means A. She has had a few partners, all of whom have not been caught, have died, or have committed suicide without giving her up. B. She's had many different partners, again all of whom have avoided denouncing her. Or C. She has had many partners, but given she works for the Thought Police, she is obviously immune from arrest. A seems plausible enough, that is, not too incredible. B is unlikely and also seems disconnected from Julia's own strategic mind, her careful planning of her meetings, and her strong knack for survival. Julia just doesn't strike me as that reckless. She wants to have fun, not to get vaporized if she can help it. C, of course, makes sense if B is also true and would explain her survival this long, given how effective the Thought Police are. I think all we can really say is that C is unlikely, given what we know eventually happens to Julia. Indeed, the end of the novel itself is clear on Julia's fate. Before we touch upon this, however, I would feel remiss if I didn't include another couple of points in favour of the spy theory. Another line later in the room also appears suspect. On seeing the picture, Julia comments that it probably has bugs behind it, though given she then says she'll give it a good clean sometime, it's obvious she's using the word in a biological sense, not in the sense of surveillance bugs. Of course, we know that there is indeed a telescreen behind the picture, and the line may be a clever bit of foreshadowing by Orwell, perhaps a sneaky clue for the eagle-eyed readers paying attention. However, this is probably simply a foreshadowing of the reveal of the telescreen itself later on, and not any indicator that Julia is a spy. A final, if limp, red flag for Julia's spy status could be her access to black market goods. Julia appears to have connections beyond any Winston has, having brought real inner-party chocolate to the meeting in the clearing, and later astonishes Winston by bringing real sugar, jam, white bread, tea and coffee to the meeting in the room. Though Julia nonchalantly answered black market when Winston asked how she got the chocolate at their first meeting, it could be explained as simply given to her by the inner party, that is, her Thought Police handlers. Interestingly though, later on in the room, Julia herself explains that such goods come from servants and waiters who steal things. We know inner party households are indeed staffed by servants, like O'Brien's man Martin. This explanation does strike me as sufficient. Winston himself buys razor blades and other goods in short supply. He also managed to procure a pen to write in his diary, which wasn't easy, and which shows there is a thriving black market of sorts. What I would suggest is that Julia is simply better at procuring such goods, and that the simplest explanation here is the best. A final series of nails in the coffin of the theory for me is in the end of Julia's story itself. We could of course argue that the assault on Julia after they were caught was all part of the act, but it does seem extreme. No one hit Winston after all. She could simply have been arrested and maintained her cover. She would have been no more suspicious than Winston himself was. That the Thought Police violently apprehended her does seem a strike to me against the spy theory. Everything we learned during Winston's interrogation could feasibly be lies on O'Brien's part to keep his agent undercover, though it's worth saying he told Winston that Julia too was interrogated and that she came over to the party quickly and was a textbook case. Though O'Brien refused to confirm it, it's also almost certain that she was tortured too. Finally, and most damning perhaps, is Julia's horrid state at the end of the book. She is physically and mentally transformed from who she had been. Winston recalls that she felt stiff as stone when he put his arm around her waist. She also had a long scar, partially concealed by her hair, across her forehead and temple. Furthermore, it's all but confirmed she went into room 101 and was forced to give up someone, very likely Winston, as she accurately describes something similar to Winston's own ordeal, and having to put someone in her place. Given this, it seems very unlikely that Julia, based on what we know in the novel, was a spy herself. A final point could be that making her a spy, in addition to Charrington and O'Brien, may be stretching credulity too much. It also doesn't make much sense for Orwell to conceal it in this way. You would think too that there would be more concrete connections and indications than what we have too. Revealing or heavily indicating she was a spy would also reinforce the hopelessness of Winston's situation too, but such indications are just not there, or that obvious anyway. I think in the end, Julia was not a spy and was genuinely in love with Winston, or at least attracted to him as some believe. This serves to highlight the tragedy of Winston himself. Orwell gives our hero a small bit of happiness for a time, with a woman he loves or cares about briefly, only to have it torn away from him, and that love or connection forever severed by Room 101. If Julia was simply another pawn of the thought police, this whole aspect of the story would be undermined. Of course, this is just my opinion. What do you think? Was Julia a spy? Write your thoughts and objections in the comments section, and drop the video a like if you enjoyed this content. Thanks for the view, and remember, Big Brother is watching you.